So it has definitely been a minute since the movie Sinners was released, but today I'm finally getting a chance to talk about it. Before I got to see it in theaters about a month ago, I saw people raving about this film, and the box office numbers have definitely been good, with them making $350 million from a $90 million budget. But I was like, you know what, I'm just gonna have to see it myself to see what everyone's been talking about. So the film was directed by Ryan Coogler, who's known for a lot of his other work too, like Creed, Fruitville Station, Black Panther, and a few others. And you know, if he's directed it, there's a good chance Michael B. Jordan is in that too. So in terms of the cast, we have Michael B. Jordan playing Smoke and Stack, Haley Steinfeld playing Mary, Wunmi Masaku playing Annie, Miles Catton playing Sammy, Jack O'Connell playing Remick, Omar Benson Miller playing Cornbread, and Delroy Lindo playing Delta Slim. Now, those were the main folks, but of course there were a few others on the list that made a cameo, but let's get into the write-up, which says, trying to leave their troubled lives behind, twin brothers return to their Mississippi hometown to start again, only to discover that an even greater evil is waiting to welcome them back. So with that in mind, let's get into a quick recap. We open to a story about some people throughout time being born with the gift to conjure spirits from both the past and future. What they recall varied from culture to culture, but they all had that gift in common, and it could be used for healing, but could also attract evil. It's 1932, Clarksdale, Mississippi, and Sammy walks in with bloodstains on his clothes in the middle of his father's Sunday service. But as he walks towards him, he sees flashes of a man with red eyes. His father wanted him to promise to leave his sinning ways behind and drop what was left of his guitar. Flashback to the day before, twins Smoke and Stack make their way back to their hometown Clarksdale in Mississippi, all the way from Chicago, with the hopes of opening a juke joint with the money they made over the years while they were gone. They meet up with the owner of a property named Hogwood, who's kind of disrespectful about the whole thing. Not only does he show up late, but he also refers to them as boys when they're clearly grown men. He starts asking questions about what they're going to do with it, but they hand him the money and they set the terms to make sure Hogwood or his buddies don't come around after the deal is closed. But they eventually get the spot, and even though the deals seem very suspicious, now they need to get a few things in order before they can open their joint later that day. First off, they pick up their little cousin Sammy after he gets his guitar from his dad, Pastor Moore. Then they get their beer and wine stash from their hideout spot, and crazy enough, almost get bitten by a snake. Then they need a sign, which they get from the Chows, and then of course they get the entertainment sorted with Delta Slim using beer to persuade him to play that night. And that's where Stack and Sammy run into Mary, who used to be his little boo thing until he just up and left her, but now she's married and still lusting after him. Then Sammy runs into Pearline, who's also married. Kind of like marriage doesn't really mean anything to these folks. But we're gonna move on. Smoke goes to see Annie, saying that he missed her, but also wanted her in charge of the food for the joint. And lastly, there's Cornbread, who's hired as their security/bouncer. Later in the evening, there's a man running towards a house in the middle of nowhere looking pretty banged up, claiming that a group of Native Americans took his wife, but he offers the couple in the house gold in exchange for them hiding him from those hunting him. They bring him into the house, and the leader of the men that were after him tells the woman that the man was not who he seemed to be and that they needed to act now. But when they leave and the wife comes inside to check on her husband, she finds that he's already been changed into some vampire, which is what I believe Remick is. That night, the joint is packed, and Annie is already giving drinks away for less than what Smoke wanted to sell them for. And Mary shows up, and she and Stack have a conversation, finally, about how she waited for this man, and also how they both still love each other. But Stack isn't really the type of guy you settle down with. After Delta Slim performs, he passes the mic over to Sammy, who starts conjuring these past and future spirits like they mentioned in the beginning. And shortly after that, Sammy and Pearline have a little moment in one of those storage closets, if you know what I mean. Remick and his two new minions approach Cornbread about being let in because they're hungry, but Smoke and Stack come to check it out. They start performing, but you can tell there's something off about these three, but they can't quite tell what it is. But it's pretty obvious that it might not be a good idea to invite them in, but Mary, convinced that they could bring good money into the joint, goes to talk to them by herself, and things get kind of weird. She has the sense to go back inside eventually, but not before they get a little nibble out of her. Cornbread invites her inside, then lets Delta Slim watch the door while he takes a bathroom break, but that's when he too gets attacked. Mary finds Stack and they have their moment that Sammy walks in on, and Cornbread is still gone. And that's when we find Stack basically bleeding to death on the ground. And Mary, after getting shot several times by Smoke, just gets up and runs away laughing like nothing just happened. Stack dies in Smoke's arms and Annie begs him to put his body outside, but Smoke doesn't listen. So Delta Slim tells everyone that the party was over and Sammy was blaming himself. But Smoke refused to put Stack's body out still. Cornbread comes back asking to be invited in, which sets everybody off because he had already been in and out of that place several times that day. But Smoke goes to give him his pay and he shows his true self. But they get back to find Stack had risen from the dead basically, and Smoke is battling his rational thinking to keep him locked away. But Stack ends up breaking out anyway to join the rest of the vampire posse for a little musical moment, and those left inside are now eating garlic to make sure that none of them were one of the outsiders. Mrs. Chow sees Mr. Chow outside and tries to convince her to let them inside, and Remick is trying his hardest to play on their heartstrings to join his little group, and as soon as he realized that's not really working, he's like, you know what? If you don't let us inside, I think we're going to pay a little visit to your daughter back at your grocery store. So their singing eventually gets to Mrs. Chow and she invites them in. So now they're forced to face them, and Annie is bitten by Stack. And as Smoke promised her, he takes her out before she turned. Delta Slim sacrificed himself to give Sammy, Smoke, and Perline a chance to get away, but they run into Remick, who attacks Perline, and now Smoke is sacrificing himself for Sammy. There was just a whole lot of sacrificing going on in this movie, but he didn't really get far. Sammy starts saying the Lord's Prayer while Stack goes after Smoke, and the herd comes out to join Remick for some type of baptism because he kept dunking Sammy in the water. And Smoke apologizes to Stack for not protecting him, but the necklace that Annie had gave him protected him against Stack. Sammy smashes his guitar across Remick's head, but thankfully Smoke gets to him before he could bite Sammy, and the sun rises and they're all consumed by fire. But Stack gives Sammy instructions to go home and destroy what's left of the guitar while he stayed behind and handled business, which brings us back to the opening scene of Sammy walking into his father's church with all the bloodstains. Smoke prepares for a showdown because sure enough Hogwood comes back with some men, but after pretty much taking out a whole group of men by himself, Smoke sat there dying because he had been shot himself, and he sees a vision of Annie with a child and she calls him Elijah and says, "If you put that cigarette out, you can hold her. I don't want any of that smoke to get on her." So Sammy left his home and that whole night behind him, but was left with a scar across his face from Remick, and decades later in 1992, he's still performing in Chicago. Then there's one mid-credits scene at the very end where we see that Stack and Mary are still alive and they pay Sammy, who's now much older, a visit. But Stack kept his promise to Smoke that they wouldn't touch him, but they offer him immortality, which he turns down. And they briefly reflect on how great the day was leading up to all the hoopla. So that was the movie in a nutshell. But I have a few things that I would like to talk about when it comes to this film. First off, the historical aspects. Right from the beginning, we're given this little history lesson about people from different cultures being given the gift of being a conjurer, but it's very clear that it can go right or left really quickly. It can be a difficult gift to control, but both Sammy and Annie seem to possess this gift. Next, we have the character of Sammy being loosely based on the blues legend Robert Johnson. There are rumors that he'd sold his soul at a crossroads in exchange for his extraordinary musical talent, but he ended up dying fairly young at just 27 years old. Personally, I would say that was a horrible deal if that was true, because he didn't really get much time at all, but in terms of the Sammy character, it makes sense considering he was this musical prodigy who has this gift of conjuring spirits, but also he meets Remick, who is promising a lot, trying to make a deal with him almost. And Ryan Coogler talks about it a little bit here.
With the spiritual deity, like you know, Papa Legba, who is arguably who they say Tommy Johnson or Robert Johnson sat down at the crossroads to get they guitar tune and sold their soul for you know musical skills for the remainder of their life. You know that in that concept of what type of deals do people in oppressive situations have to make and have to rationalize, and me realizing that, oh yeah, man, I'm from Oakland, but it was a time when there wasn't no black people in Oakland. They all had to come from somewhere. And where did they leave? You know what I'm saying? They left home. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. And if for me it was like, oh yeah, it's always a deal.
I think what he speaks about could also connect to life at that time for people that weren't white and how hard life was after slavery had ended. Black people and black families still had to make the best decisions to propel each other forward and pretty much make a better life for themselves. And I think that in this film, Remick knew that, and he kept preying on that entire movie to try to lure them into joining him. But let's talk about the fantasy aspect. In this case, it was obviously the vampires, and the most important component about them to me is their rule of having to be invited in, and I think it's kind of explained beautifully in this video that I found.
Vampires are always asking to be invited in. They're waiting, watching, asking, and you might be wondering why. Out of all the supernatural abilities they have, they get stopped cold by a locked front door unless someone says, come in. We're talking ancient folklore where people believed evil couldn't enter your home unless you welcomed it. It's about consent, control, vulnerability. But until you say yes, it's powerless. It manipulates you into letting it in, and that's the scary part. That little moment of trust is all it takes.
From a storytelling perspective, it is pretty genius, and they played on it over and over again, which created such an interesting plot. And there was even some tension and anxiety there because you, as the audience member, I feel, are trying to figure out if these characters are going to fall for those tactics. Lastly, let's touch on the spiritual components. I saw someone over on TikTok basically break down their thoughts when it came to the characters pretty much embodying the 7 deadly sins, and I was like, you know what? I think you might be right.
The 7 deadly sins are portrayed as characters in the film Sinners. Stack is greed. He seems to be the driving force behind getting money by any means necessary. He's the schemer. His decisions aren't made for the stability and the well-being of himself and his brother. He wants more for the sake of having more. Smoke is wrath. He errs on the side of vengeance, whether it's righteous or not, and that is his downfall. And we see this when he stays behind to kill the clan members, even though he could have fled with Sammy. Speaking of Sammy, he represents sloth. We hear sloth and we tend to think of outright laziness, but sloth from a biblical sense is a neglect of spiritual duty, a spiritual apathy that pushes him into not taking heed of his father's warning. Perline is undoubtedly lust. She's married, she knew good and well Sammy wanted her, and she gave into the temptation of the flesh. No further explanation needed. Delta Slim is gluttony. He is a drunkard whose only focus is to drown out any feelings of sorrow with a bottle. We see him go to the juke joint not even for more money, but for his insatiable thirst for liquor. Remick is envy. He wants Sammy's talent, his songs, and his ability to connect to his ancestors. We see this connection being opened up and felt by everyone in the juke joint through Sammy's music. Remick wants that power for himself. And finally, Grace is pride. She had an inflated sense of self-importance. What she wanted was more important than keeping the entire group safe, and because of her actions, more people were killed. Some of you may say Smoke was actually pride and Grace was wrath, or maybe Mary was envy because she couldn't be with Stack since she was white passing, and therefore she envies other couples in the community.
I'm not sure if that's what they were going for in the film, but I sure enough did see it. Also, the idea that music in many cases can serve as some type of portal is very interesting because all my life growing up in the church, that's all people used to talk about. They tell you to be careful what you listen to, especially when you're sleeping, because it can seep into your subconscious and it could also welcome things in, whether that be thoughts or spirits. But whether you believe that or not, I think it kind of reigns true here, especially in that scene where Sammy starts singing and you see all the spirits dancing. And even when Remick is outside with the group that he's turned, dancing and singing, it all revolved around music. But that was pretty much all I wanted to say on this one, besides it really being beautifully shot. I think my only thing with this film is that I wish it outlasted more than just the 24 hours, because this film literally takes place all within one day. So I wish they had spread it out a little bit more, but I do think that if they wanted to, a spin-off telling Smoke and Stack's story when they were up in Chicago would be great. I would love that, because I would personally like to know where the heck they got this money from. But let me know your thoughts in the comments on this one, and if you enjoyed it, I'll catch you all in the next video.